I was drawn to Augustine because I was helping people with broken hearts.
You could say, I think, that Augustine is a pioneer of the psychological, that he was extremely interested in his own life, how he grew, and how he grew brought him face to face with God.
And he made an intense interior examination of his feelings, of his actions, of his relationships, in a way that is thoroughly modern.
You stir us to take pleasure in praising you, because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you.
Although he was born over 16 centuries ago, Augustine of Hippo is remembered still as a founding father of Western Christianity. A brilliant theologian, a prolific writer, his longing for God was restless and relentless. His spiritual pilgrimage holds meaning today for anyone searching for the point where God and the self meet. Augustine tells his story in the poignant Confessions, an autobiographical prose poem that is at once psychological and theological.
For Augustine, theology is not an abstraction. Theology is prayer, and one's thought takes place in the context of prayer, and therefore it literally is about the knowledge of God. It is not stepping back from God and thinking. It is an active conversation with God, which involves all of one's critical faculties. And therefore, I think people forget, because we have a different understanding of confession. We think of lurid magazines on, supermarket stands. For Augustine, his confession, remember, is a confession to God. And the confessions, in sense, are a very long prayer. His conversation partner is God. That's who he's talking to.
Augustine reflects a great deal with God about his early life. Born in what is now eastern Algeria, Augustine stood to inherit a few acres of land farmed by his pagan father, Patrick. His Christian mother, Monica, held lofty goals for her eldest child. But shortly after Patrick died, the teenage Augustine began living with a woman Monica deemed beneath him, and he criticized Christians like herself as superstitious. Angry and hurt, Monica refused to allow Augustine into her home until a dream which Augustine relates in his Confessions.
A young man asked her the reasons she was downcast and daily in floods of tears. She replied that she mourned my perdition. He then told her to have no anxiety and to see that where she was, there was I also. By the dream, the joy of this devout woman was predicted many years in advance. When she asked a bishop to talk to me, he answered that I was still unready to learn. But my mother was still unwilling to take no for an answer. She pressed him with more beggings and with floods of tears. He was now irritated and a little vexed and said, "Go away from me. As you live, it cannot be that the son of so many tears should perish."
Augustine ignored his mother's tears for at least another decade and steered clear of Christianity. A quick study, he filled his student days with malicious mischief, including the infamous theft of pears.
After shaking the fruit from the tree, a gang and I carried off a huge load of pears. But they were not for our feasts, but merely to throw at the pigs. Even if we ate a few, our pleasure lay in doing what was not allowed.
Like every episode in his life, Augustine closely analyzed his adolescence, especially its friendships.
I think he thinks that the highest form of ordinary human relationship is friendship, where people can share their ideas and their feelings with one another on a basis of equality, not in a relationship of domination of any kind, but sheerly on a basis of equality. And so friendship, I think, becomes a kind of image of community for him. And he, like many Christian bishops of his time, he lived in a kind of community, even though he was unmarried. He had what was called a familia, a household around him of other clergy, people who were learning about things in the church and so on.
Although friends remained important to Augustine throughout his life, he learned that he couldn't define himself through his friends, but only through God.
Where was I when I was seeking for you, Lord? You were there before me, but I had departed from myself. I could not even find myself, much less you.
Augustine's search for meaning and peace became even more urgent after the death of a close boyhood friend, and so he left home, hoping to escape his grief and to find both God and himself.
My hometown became a torture to me. All that I had shared with him was without him transformed into a cruel torment. My eyes looked for him everywhere, and he was not there. I hated everything. I had become to myself a vast problem.
One modern author has referred to Augustine as the first modern person. And I think that's because of this remark that he makes in two places in the Confessions where he says, I have become a problem to myself. He is very much a person who is searching for his own self-identity, and he is constantly engaged in trying, as it were, to pull himself together, the self that lies in the past, the self that is coming in the future, the self that sees in the present, to get all this together into a unity. And that, I think, is why he writes the Confessions the way he does. That is to say, he addresses it to God because he believes that only in the presence of God are all these different bits of himself, which lie scattered all over the world, pulled together into one.
Augustine spent most of his 20s crisscrossing the Mediterranean and steadily climbing to the top of academia as a professor of rhetoric. Still dissatisfied, Augustine coveted civic office, but he lacked the money to purchase such a position. As was common practice, Augustine dismissed his low-born lover, which freed him for marriage based on wealth and status. Although Augustine later denounced this practice, by then his lover was long gone.
And they had a child, even. So it would have been very painful for him, as he says in the Confessions, to surrender this relationship. And she, apparently, announced that she would have no other and just went home. So it was a very painful moment in his life and in hers.
My heart, which was deeply attached, was cut and wounded and left a trail of blood. She had returned to Africa vowing that she would never go with another man. She left me with the natural son I had by her, but I was unhappy.
First giving up his love, Augustine gave up sex altogether, pruning his life of all practices he believed kept him from God.
The human problem is not a lack of love, because we can't help it. We are simply by nature lovers. But our problem is that we love the wrong thing in the wrong way, and therefore our love is always on the move. It never rests.
I was wretched when I prayed, grant me chastity and continence, but not yet. But the day had now come when I stood naked to myself and my conscience complained against me. I was gnawing at my inner self.
He was on a well-trodden path in his day towards eminence in the Roman civil service. He might have risen to be the governor of a province or something of that sort. But his conversion stopped all that.
Imagine Augustine, who has been the chair of rhetoric in Milan, very sophisticated, extremely learned person, and And we switch scenes, so suddenly he's in a garden somewhere. He's with his friends, and his mother is around, and he's sitting and reading a book in the house, and suddenly he hears a voice. He hears, "Take and read, take and read." It's like a nursery rhyme. And Augustine, who's so sophisticated, is thinking, well, children? Who's out there? Who's doing this? And suddenly, Augustine, who is also so brilliant, remembers a book that he had read about Antony's conversion. And so Augustine decides to listen to these voices and goes out into the garden and hears "take and read," and he picks up Paul's letter to the Romans. Picks up scriptures and he says, "Okay, here we go." And he opens the book, and his eyes fall on the verses that he knew that God wanted him to hear. And that's the point where he understood the longing for God, and his search, his entire life, was finally at the place where God and he came together.
We misconceive if we think of radical before and after, like type A and type B. All of a sudden you've got a different person. I don't see that in his biography. I see a much more gradual growth through a lot of different experiences, many of which happened after his baptism.
Viewing his conversion as a beginning and not an end, Augustine sought baptism by Ambrose, the bishop whose intellect and preaching ability he so admired. Augustine could not have known how closely his life would parallel that of his mentor. But, like Ambrose, Augustine would be made a priest, a bishop, and a saint.
Augustine's hope after he became a Christian was to be a monk and to live a life of reflection, quiet reflection in the country with his friends. They would discuss questions of Platonic philosophy, questions of interpretation of Scripture. Then he was injudicious enough to go to visit a friend who was sick in a place where they needed a priest. And when they saw him, the people all yelled that they wanted him, so he was shanghaied really into becoming a priest. It was not his idea at all. And a few years later then his bishop died and he became bishop. And after that, his was a life of service.
I think of Augustine as a great pastor before anything else. And how he was able to use his incredible mind and all that training he had had earlier in life in rhetoric and law and all those things. And he took that knowledge and he integrated it with his life in God and his love of people.
The task of a bishop in those days was rather different from what it is now. A bishop was more like the senior pastor of a big church. And one of the duties of a bishop was, of course, to be the community's magistrate. He heard cases, disputes on certain days of the week. Another duty of the bishop was handing out food and money to people who were in need, a social service system. Another was teaching. And I would say that those were the three most obvious duties of a bishop. There were parts of it that he didn't like. He hated to keep books, for example. Finances were not his thing. But yes, I would say he was a very good and very energetic bishop.
The church had schisms all over the place. People were stoning one another. It was pretty rough. And he wondered how in the world you can do that and live a holy life. And it was to live a holy life that was his fundamental driving desire.
As Bishop of Hippo, Augustine felt isolated in an area that has been called an intellectual backwater. His loneliness deepened when his brilliant teenage son died, and his mother Monica, of so many tears, had died only a few months after Augustine's baptism and just a few days after sharing a fleeting mystical vision with her son.
She and I were standing leaning out of a window overlooking a garden. Step by step, we climbed beyond the heaven itself, where sun, moon, and stars shed light on the earth. We ascended even further by internal reflection and dialogue and wonder at your works. We touched it in some small degree by a moment of total concentration of the heart, and we sighed as we returned to the noise of our human speech, where a sentence has both a beginning and an ending.
Monica herself would be made a saint, and although she and Augustine had shared a stormy relationship, he found that his mourning for her was so deep he was sometimes at a loss even for tears. Augustine's losses of his boyhood friend, his love, his son, and his mother convinced him that human relationships are the most precious goods of this life. Yet he also recognized that attaching ourselves to that which will inevitably change or pass away leads to our suffering.
And this, I think, runs across the grain of the modern consciousness. We, in fact, want satisfaction and happiness, and we understand it in terms of satisfactions of things by means of which Augustine would simply have said, this is ridiculous. It can't deliver the goods.
So Augustine, in being God-focused, helps us rearrange our loves and our lives toward God, who is the ultimate good, and the truest love, and the best love, and the love who will not abandon us.
Augustine is in the great Platonic tradition, which says that love is good. All love is good. But you might say some loves are better than others. And so there's a hierarchy of loves. And a lot of Augustine's teaching has to do with the discipline of moving from inferior loves to superior loves.
Only he who loves God knows how to love himself. For without the love of God, we cannot know the self to be loved.
By the end of his long life, Augustine knew both the God who had seemed so elusive and the self who had seemed so enigmatic, and he had learned to live with change, although he always longed for eternal changelessness.
One of the themes through his preaching is that in the next life, after we have died to this life and gone on, our relationships with other people will be unchanging. We won't lose friends, people won't move away, we won't have wonder what they're thinking about us today, whether their opinion is going to change. That kind of uncertainty, he says over and over again, will not, that will not be left behind. We'll have the kind of relationships with other people which will endure.
He lived through the period when the Roman Empire in the West was in a state of collapse. And when he died, reciting the penitential psalms on his deathbed, the Vandals were besieging Hippo and were about to establish a kingdom in North Africa.
Even though the world Augustine knew collapsed, his work endures. Especially in this uncertain century, Augustine serves as a pioneer for all those who search for lasting meaning in their lives.
I had finished almost 10 years in East Africa, and I saw General Amin come to power, and I saw the social fabric of a world that I'd known for 10 years torn to pieces. And I lost my optimism about the possibilities for human advance and perfection that were very much a part of my youth and my American background. And I began to think that life is a lot more fragile and complex and subject to loss than I had ever thought. And that brought me back to Augustine.
It isn't so much that you can get a technique from Augustine. Rather, it is that he allows you to follow a singularly honest analysis of what it means to seek God and to have a taste of God without being an extraordinarily gifted mystic. I don't think he was an extraordinarily gifted mystic. He was much more ordinary in that particular respect. And his pilgrimage, therefore, is one from which people who don't see themselves as great spiritual giants can learn a great deal, because I don't think he saw himself as a great spiritual giant. He saw himself as a puzzled and sometimes disappointed inquirer, but he never gave up the path along which he had determined to inquire.
How late I came to love you. O beauty so ancient and so fresh, how late I came to love you. You were within me while I had gone outside to seek you, and always you were with me and I was not with you. You called, you cried, you shattered my deafness, you sparkled, you blazed, you drove away my blindness. You shed your fragrance, and I drew in my breath, and I panted for you. I tasted, and now I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and now I burn with longing for your peace.